police officer was found not guilty of murdering a suspect during an arrest, despite evidence suggesting that he did. So we're going to talk a bit about how we put together our plan to cover this story, and specifically how we wove together on-the-ground coverage and social media coverage, both in terms of telling the story publicly and coordinating background logistics and reporter safety as well. A bit of background on us. We've been working together for a few years. Back in 2014, 15, I'm already forgetting when it was.
14.
Yes, that sounds right. We launched a social reporting project called Reportedly that was based at First Look Media. And the idea behind it was to use social to uncover stories around the world, mostly related to human rights and social justice, and cover it live using real-time tools. And then about a year and a half ago, as we wrapped up Reportedly, we started working our way towards NowThis, which, if you're not familiar with, is a US-based newsroom that focuses on creating social video for Facebook. It's the largest video news producer on Facebook, with around, 13 million fans and a couple of billion views a month. And so we were brought on board at NowThis as non-video people to help them think through their breaking news strategy, to develop workflows for breaking news, and to teach them about new ways of incorporating social media and specifically social reporting into their work. And so the case study we're going to walk ourselves through for you was one of the products of those activities.
So a little bit about the case study that we're going, the story that we're talking about. So St. Louis was probably put on the map because of the Ferguson protests. And the interesting thing is this case happened before Ferguson. It happened in actually 2011, and I think the Ferguson case happened in 2013. Yeah. 2013, I think. So the very short rundown of the case is there was the police officers there were beat cops, and there was what they thought they saw was a drug deal, and they chased the suspect by a car, and then he got out. And then they shot him. So there was video of this. So there was some social video, and then there was also the car cam. And on the car cam, you can hear one of the officers basically say, "We're gonna kill this person." And then there was some video of after the shooting, and you can't see what's happening, but it looks like the officer is going back to his patrol car and then getting something and then going back to the suspect's car where he was shot.
And there was a gun found on the scene with the suspect, but the only fingerprints on the gun was of the police officer.
Yeah. So the guy that was on trial was originally they decided not to pursue any sort of charges, but then the family of this young man decided to sue civilly, and they settled with the city of St. Louis, and through that civil lawsuit they found more evidence that police had not done a very good job of showing, and the DA decided not to pursue. So that's why the case happened last year, even though it's a 2011 case. So they had decided not to do charges, but then found new evidence, so it was brought back before a judge. It was the reason we decided to go, a couple reasons, was we knew that we had a tip that the verdict was going to be not guilty based on somebody else's prior work in St. Louis, and it also, there had been a lot of the activists had said, if this verdict comes back not guilty, it's going to be worse than Ferguson. We're going to protest, for 300 days. We're going to do all of this. So it's already a city that has very long-standing racial issues. This is a case that is very deep and intense, and the cop, Jason Stockley, was up for murder, which is pretty rare for a police officer in the U.S. Do you want me to go through this?
Yeah, so once we got the tip that the verdict was going to be handed down that Friday, this all came together very quickly. We first heard about it on Wednesday, I believe.
Yeah, Wednesday.
And by Thursday evening, we had flown in a team of 10 people to cover the case, essentially swarm the story so they could break out into teams of two or three teams at a time, depending on what was being covered. So they could tackle the story from different angles, such as following the protests, seeing how community leaders are responding, how local officials are responding. Meanwhile, so Kim was the most senior member of the team that went down with the other producers, and then I stayed in New York to be a lead editor for our breaking coverage for that day and through the weekend, and to also be in charge of monitoring and posting on social media, essentially serving as an eyes in the sky, looking from above virtually to see what was going on, and that ended up becoming important as things got out of hand, which we'll talk about in a bit.
This was a little bit different for NowThis. NowThis they had covered the stuff live before, and they had, I don't know, like the Republican National Gathering. They had done some live coverage. They had done some other stuff, but they had never really done live the way we did it in St. Louis. And that was, they had done live video, but they hadn't done live anchored video on top of doing live social coverage. So this was a little bit different. We also used this as an excuse to launch a new account for NowThis, which was @Newsroom, which was what Andy was running while I was in St. Louis.
Right. So if you're familiar with NowThis, NowThis does usually short videos, square form most of the time, yellow text on the screen, and that's that you see a lot on different news sites now, but they were the ones who pioneered the technique. And through most of NowThis's history of, 4 years now, I guess, since it was founded? Maybe 5?
6,
Oh,
maybe.
6? Is it 6 now?
I think it's 6.
They specialized in curating pre-existing content, and so the idea of sending a team that large in particular, to do a breaking news event where we were pretty sure we knew what the outcome was, but we weren't positive, was a very new thing for the company to do. It was very much an experiment.
So I think the point was we were going to try to cover it from multiple angles, which is why we sent so many people. So that's why there was 10 instead of like 2 or 3. So I was, most of the time I spent leading a team that did live coverage. So I was in front of the camera doing live videos and running my own periscopes and live tweeting. There was a team that stayed with the governor pretty much the whole time, and local officials. They kind of stayed near the cops and the governor. And then there was another team that worked with the community. There's a lot of church officials that were very active, and so we did a bunch of stories. We went there not knowing what we would produce and not having any goal of, like, we're going to do X many videos out of this, we're going to do X, Y, Z. We were going to see what happened, which meant we were regularly checking in with folks and regularly kind of figuring out what our coverage arc would be.
Right, and apart from the fact that we knew we were pretty sure that the verdict was going to come down. The main sign of it is that they put barricades around the courthouse, and so that was the final piece that allowed us to take the budget and let us buy tickets. But apart from that, we weren't 100% sure that it was going to be not guilty. I mean, we were 95% sure, but there was still a chance it wouldn't be. And so working under the assumption that it would be now not guilty. There would be protests, but exactly what form they would take, and how the police responded and all that was still up in the air. And so beyond knowing the general structure of what happens when a not guilty plea comes down, we didn't know where we were going to be at any given time for most of those days.
Go ahead.
Unsurprisingly, not guilty, despite all the evidence suggesting that he was at least guilty of manslaughter. He was found not guilty of murder. The presiding judge said something to the effect of, who's heard of a heroin dealer that doesn't carry a gun? And so he was clearly very biased against the suspect, and didn't buy into the idea that the gun could have been planted. Needless to say, this did not go over well with the community, and so I've got it saying 100 days of protest, but Kim's right. The local clergy and activists said they were going to have 300 days of protests. And unsurprisingly, lots of anger and frustration breaking out across the community, both in St. Louis proper and the surrounding county.
Something that's important, I guess, about why NowThis decided to do this is that when we were there the day that the not guilty verdict came out, we were the only national organization that was there, and everyone else was local. And I think that made it more interesting as a newsroom. Like, we could own this story. And I think we talked about that from the beginning. We're like, no one else has covered this. It's a very local story, but it definitely has the signs of being something bigger. And that's a byproduct of having our ear to the ground and having done this kind of reporting before. I don't think that you can do this on every single story, and even subsequently now, when NowThis covers stuff live, cover the Parkland shooting or the Las Vegas shooting, we send much smaller teams because everybody else is covering it. So you don't need 10 people when the whole world is covering a story. But we needed 10 people because there was just nothing else we could pull from. There wasn't even CNN did not show up until 3 days into the protests, yeah, I think a Huffington Post was the only people who were there pretty early.
Yeah.
About live. So live coverage is it's a very popular medium these days. I think everybody's trying to do live. I would say that's partially because Facebook likes to weight live video much heavier. So anytime I'm on Facebook, I see it's usually like live video or Facebook Watch are the kind of the highest videos I see. I think they're starting to more and more devalue those kind of short 90-second shorter videos that NowThis is known for. And we had a lot of questions about how to do this, and we did a lot of trial and error. So before we went, we were like, well, what do we do? Do we do a Facebook Live, or do we a Periscope? Instagram Live was also launched at that point, and so we went having the options of doing all of them. And the team at home who ran the NowThis Facebook page, they knew that we could do anything. So we use, as most newsrooms use, we use Slack to coordinate with the publishing team. So the day the verdict came out, we're like, okay, we're gonna go live as soon as the verdict happens. But it just happened so quickly that setting up a Facebook Live takes a couple minutes. And so it's hard to do when something's breaking very quickly, because you have to, in order to be able to you have to have a title, you have to have a description, and you have to be ready. Yeah,
it's one of the reasons why lots of Facebook Lives start 5, 10, even 15 minutes before a live event, because you can't set it up at the last minute like that.
Yeah.
Without missing something.
And it's also why a lot of people run Facebook Lives from their personal accounts as opposed to a brand page. It's much harder with a brand page because there's a lot more. And we had to be careful because the NowThis news page is huge. So it couldn't be, if I started on my personal Facebook page, it's a couple hundred people. But this was millions of people, so we wanted to make sure we were doing it right. We had to make sure we copy edited the text that we were doing, so it took a little bit longer. So we actually ended up, right as the verdict came down, using just taking short video on our phones, and then we would sidebar, and then we would do a Facebook Live. We learned a lot about doing Facebook Live very quickly. batteries run out very quickly with Facebook Live. And it was just, we did not have like the best gear. We probably had like the worst gear that NowThis had, because there was another team doing something else and they had taken all the good camera
because it was
equipment.
a last minute project. The ops desk had a limited amount of equipment available to us.
Yeah, most of the good equipment was going to like the Juggalo March in DC. So like we had like the leftover stuff that had been duct taped together, which was fine. Another quick lesson that we learned was you can't do it by yourself. Particularly covering a protest, we would always break up into teams of 2. I was very concerned about people being on their own in a massive protest with police, and we don't have press badges. You know, we don't have official press badges for St. Louis. We just had our NowThis IDs, which were literally a piece of paper that was laminated. So that said we worked for NowThis. So there was nothing to prevent us from being arrested. So it was very much, and we also learned that the person holding the camera, running the live, it's very hard for them to host. It's just you can't hold a thing, host, and know where you're going at the same time. So usually we would have someone holding the camera, a producer holding the camera, and then that's how I ended up in front of the camera. There was never any like intent for me to be on camera. I had no designs. I don't have broadcast training, but it was just because it didn't make sense. And otherwise you would just hear this voice and you couldn't see a person, and people were like, what's happening? I don't understand what's going on when you saw a person talking. And I think that's where the broadcast model fits in a little bit into lives, a little bit better.
And then sometimes, especially when it got to late at night each evening when protests were getting tense and the police looked like they were on edge as well, sometimes we would employ a third person as part of the team. De facto security. They would, as the camera person and the host would be doing their thing, they would be right behind them, looking around them. Basically, they've got their 6. They're paying attention to make sure whatever's happening behind them isn't going to get them run over or shot at or anything. And so it was very organic. Sometimes that person might have been someone who was going to do a quick Periscope stream of their own, but it became clear that this is a good moment to shut down and help another team. And so it was very fluid in that everyone who was on the ground did different tasks at different times, which allowed us to be pretty nimble on the scene for the 4 or 5 days we ended up covering it.
Yeah.
And here's just a sample. This is one of the videos.
Hopefully the Wi-Fi cooperates.
Yeah, so this is a particular moment in one of the videos. This is Periscope, so the video quality isn't as strong as Facebook Live. This is a very tense moment where there are a number of angry protesters who've been screaming at the police and cursing at them. Was this right after the person almost got run over?
Yeah, there was, we learned on the ground, because there was just, the tensions ran high, so rumors ran very quickly. And there were many, many people live streaming. So we had to make very quick decisions. And this came from nowhere. So what happened was there was a car that kind of went really quickly through a line of protesters and almost I don't actually think anyone was in any danger of getting hit, but it went from
It scared them a lot.
A car came really close to somebody to oh my God, they tried to run that guy over.
Reminiscent of what happened in Charlotte. That was
Yeah.
the initial reaction that something intentional was going on.
And then was it a police officer? Was it not a police officer? Is this the police's fault? So we spent a lot of time trying to explain to people that there are rumors of this, but there's no proof of that. I found myself saying that a lot.
So in this particular section, there wasn't voiceover or hosting because the man on the left wearing the flag-like shirt, his name is Bruce Franks. He was one of the leading protesters during Black Lives Matter in Ferguson and eventually ran for office and won a state senator for his local district. And so he's still an activist, but he's also a local official. And so he served semi-officially as the person who would liaise with the police when things got tense. And so as a group of protesters were getting very angry and worried on one side, he was negotiating with this particular police officer who appeared a lot in videos over of several coming days for a variety of reasons to try to keep things cool, which he was able to do at least temporarily that evening.
That police officer is also really well known from Ferguson. So one of the things that helped us was that I had watched Ferguson and I had done some social coverage of it. So, and we contacted a lot of people beforehand. So as we were like on the plane flying to St. Louis, I was reading court documents and then emailing as many people as possible to say like, hey, can we meet? Or can I have your cell phone number to try and figure it out as we got there. We used WhatsApp to coordinate between the team. So 'cause Slack is just crazy and we didn't want to set up we had a channel, but it was mostly for people to talk about like actual coverage. So just, you know, things like if I was on a live and I needed to talk louder, it would, you know, Andy would message me and say like, hey, speak up. No one can hear you. And so he watched every single live that we did as we were doing it and gave us tech direction, essentially.
Yeah.
Because no one on the ground could hear. So it's hard to know what's happening when you're there.
And so we'll show some examples of that shortly. As Kim just said, we decided not to use Slack largely because Slack is such an important part of the way NowThis works that creating yet another Slack channel didn't seem like it had captured the gravity of the situation. And so while there was a Slack channel to coordinate basic editorial activities among the staff in New York for coordination with the team on the ground with any type of logistics or security issues, WhatsApp, we decided to have it completely separate. I think it certainly helped us stay safe those several days.
Yeah, it also helped because notifications. So if I was on camera, I could see on my phone very quick, which I usually had in my hand, that a buzz and then Andy telling me something or somebody saying something like move or whatever. It was easier than, you know, like literally having a producer do this or whatever, or like me pausing and saying, what did he say? I could just read it very quickly. So we used that.
Yeah. Regarding the social coverage that we did for the public, well, we use social tools both public-facing and internally as well. For the public, it's largely the kind of stuff you would expect from, certainly from us, but you know, in general, when covering a live event like a protest, I coordinated and did most of the live tweeting myself for the protests, press conferences, other activities that were happening, as well as curating local activists and officials on the ground, plus any social that was being produced individually, informally as well by the team that was there. And so I essentially served as a host on Twitter to help people navigate the story for several days. But at the same time, those same social tools I used to figure out what was going on, whether it was Twitter lists or looking at the Facebook Live map to see what new videos were popping up around St. Louis, those streams became vital for me to have an understanding of have situational awareness, to know when protests were relaxed and the police were relaxed versus when things were getting tense. Because sometimes when you've got a protest that has several thousand people in it, the front of the protest, things might be going perfectly fine and well organized, but the back you might have some very angry people. And so since even with a team, with 2 or 3 teams out at any given time, we still can't be everywhere. And so using social media to monitor the situation on the ground for logistics and for safety reasons was just as important, if not more important, than the live coverage I was doing through our Twitter account. So here's just a sample of what during one of the days I would tweet essentially doing color commentary. if you will, of what I was seeing through the various live streams. So one of our colleagues, Mike Madden, he had a Periscope going. Was that a Periscope? Yeah. During one of the protests, in which, I don't know if you can see the man in the white T-shirt, he was literally in the face of several police, like, you know, this far away from the police, cursing at them and screaming at them and trying to provoke them. And other protesters were trying to pull him back, and others were trying to let him do what he was doing because they wanted an incident to happen. So it was very, very tense. Eventually things got ugly, and the police declared the situation an unlawful gathering, or an unlawful assembly. And so as the shit was hitting the fan, I was able to watch it and to monitor what they're up to, as well as giving that live color commentary to the public. Meanwhile, though, as Kim talked about a few minutes earlier, WhatsApp became a lifeline for us on the ground. As you can see here on the right, we had a channel where when things were relatively okay, we could just let people know what's going on, what the scene feels like, what we think is worth covering. So in this particular case, this young man was walking around with an AK-47. Missouri, the state of Missouri is an open carry state, which means if you own a gun or a rifle, you are allowed to carry it in public without any legal repercussions. And so he was there as one of the protesters, but also to exercise his Second Amendment rights to carry an assault rifle. So we used WhatsApp to figure out, are we going to talk to this guy? Are we going to talk to someone else? Where's the action happening? And when we were in the middle of videos, especially when Kim would be hosting, or when she was interviewing someone, or we were trying to listen to a protester make a statement, this is essentially what it looked like from Kim's point of view. I would be messaging, telling them what things they should be doing. So, you know, keep the mic closer. I can't hear. Speak into it. Describe the mood. Is it tense? Sometimes there'd be questions over Twitter that I would relay this way. Stay hydrated. You know, little things like that to be sort of their conscience over their shoulder, reminding them to look out for themselves as well as doing the work that they were doing. It seemed useful for you guys, and hopefully didn't annoy
no,
you too much.
it wasn't. The nice thing about it was I didn't have to worry about any of that stuff because I had somebody who was watching the feed as it was going and was just telling me what to do. So all I had to worry about was like what's happening right in front of me, which is what I wanted to worry about. I feel like at other times I've covered live things, I have to worry about like what it sounds like and is it okay, and I'm like looking at the phone trying to figure it out. But having just someone tell me like what to do took a lot of weight off and let us be better reporters.
And then this happened.
There's still a drum here.
So the thing I think audiences don't care about, which sometimes we care too much about, is they like raw stuff. They, in instances where I was running or like doing stuff like that, they don't care.
White people and all black down there breaking shit.
I think there's an assumption that web video has to be high quality or has to be like a documentary style, but for live coverage, for breaking, for real time, it doesn't matter. People want it to be kind of gritty. Don't care if they can't see anything. They kind of want to feel like they're there.
And in this particular moment, rubber bullets were being shot at you? Was that?
Yeah, near us. near us. I was also like the most senior person on the ground, so, and working with a lot of producers who had never been in any sort of tense situation. So I also felt like this kind of like, I don't know, like a pack mom kind of feeling, making sure that they were all okay because, and knowing that what we had, I mean, we were pretty concerned because none of us had like KEFAT training or anything like that. We didn't have, you know, like a lawyer on staff that would like bail us out and stuff like that. So it was a little, we had to make sure that things were going well.
And so as you can see here, this is the moment in the Slack, not the Slack channel, the WhatsApp channel, when Kim started running and I heard the police on the microphone in the background and people started screaming. It took several minutes to get the team's attention again because I don't know, you ran that block, and one of our people, Mike Madden, he had been streaming and then he vanished and we didn't know where he was for a few minutes. But you kept streaming, and so I kept telling them to sign off and find your team. With various levels of success, but. What ended up happening is that became the beginning of a series of incidences where the police cracked down on protests and began arresting people, including the journalists on the scene, as well as ACLU monitors on the scene. If you were there, the police regarded you as participating in an unlawful gathering. And so in this particular part of the story, Kim and her team had to go seek shelter. Was in someone's apartment. You just basically... It's
like someone was walking their dog and let us into their apartment, basically. But what was handy about this, I think, was so the police were using a tactic called kettling, which is they're now being sued for doing, which is if you're protesting, the police would basically block all access on blocks and then basically push everybody to one intersection. Completely illegal to do. You're supposed to be able, the police are supposed to be able to give people outs. It's like, you know, people got arrested who were not protesting, were not doing any sort of violence. There were a number of like live streamers and journalists who got arrested for just being there. So what they wanted to put everybody in a kettle and then just arrest all of them. Which is not great. And the only reason we didn't get arrested, because I was hanging out with people that got arrested, was because Andy was like, don't go that way.
Yeah.
Because he was watching somebody else's stream.
Yeah, so these next few slides, at this point I stopped tweeting for a bit because even though I'm pretty good at multitasking, live tweeting and helping them avoid arrest was just something I couldn't balance very well. So I focused all of my attention on identifying every single live stream, Periscope, Facebook live video, whatever I could find happening in real time to see where the police were and what formations they were placing themselves into, where the kettling was going to happen. So while that was happening in one particular part of town, I was able to tell them to walk around the perimeter of it with enough leeway in between them that the likelihood of them being arrested was much lower if they tried to go straight through. So they would send me, Kim would send me screenshots of exactly where they were based on geolocation on her phone, and then I would match that to where the protests and the police arrests were happening according to the live videos, and then using Google Maps, I would draw out a new path for them to walk their way around. And so eventually they were able to get back to the hotel while a number of other journalists, including several from St. Louis Post-Dispatch, several citizen journalists were all rounded up and spent the night in jail. And they also got maced with pepper spray, didn't they? Yeah,
they got maced. And it was not great. We were very lucky, and I think that the only reason we were lucky was because we had somebody. Because it's just hard when you're surrounded by people. The cell phone signal is not great. I don't know where I'm supposed to go. I don't know where the cops are. They're like that way. They're that way somewhere, I think, maybe. And scrolling through Twitter to try to figure out which way to go is just not. It's not practical. It's not safe. I almost got in a lot of trouble because I was looking at my phone one time, trying to figure out where to go next instead of just like being there and letting Andy direct us. So I felt like every minute I was looking down was a minute where it was putting us in danger.
Exactly.
Okay, so what did we do with all of that? We had so much footage, we crashed our server. So much footage. Because we were not only taking live, we did all of this live stuff, but during the day, or we would just do like long interviews with like, big cameras and nice cameras. So I think part of the thing that was most difficult for us was mixing low quality Periscope video later with the high quality sit down interviews I did with like the ACLU and longtime activists, and how to make those look good is very tough and kind of look kind of seamless. We had some wonderful editors who made it look not as bad. What we didn't anticipate was we were on the ground for, well, my team particularly, the team that did live coverage, was on the ground for over a week.
We'd expected to be there for maybe 2 days, 3 days max.
Yeah, we had to go buy like underwear and clothes like twice. 'Cause we just were not prepared. So we just didn't anticipate, that we would do so many long form stories, and then how tired we would be when we came home once we were done with the adrenaline. And so like one of the biggest lessons that we probably learned from this is that somebody should be in charge of who is not on the ground should be in charge of long-term production. So we really needed a producer who hadn't gone, who could look at the whole of everything we had and say, like, these were the stories. That's not what we did. That was a failure on our part. What we did was we sat in a cafe, all of us still high on adrenaline, then, some morning, and we decided what the stories were. In retrospect, I don't think all of those stories were great, and or the best stories to do, or that we needed to do so many. We didn't have, now this is a very flat structure, so that we didn't have like an editor, essentially, to do that. We ended up producing 4 long-form pieces. By long-form, I mean longer than 6 minutes. It was very expensive, and it took months for us to do. So we were there in September. One of the pieces didn't publish until December. It took too long. And that's just because everybody that came back, we had to go back to our regular jobs. So we couldn't block out, 3 weeks to produce long-form stuff. We didn't have that luxury. So it was a bit of a lesson for NowThis and for us. Do you have a link on that one? Can you just put like 2 seconds of that?
Oh, did I do a link? No, I did not. Sorry about that.
That's all right. So we did, this was the longest piece that we did, it was just an overview of the case. We also did an overview of the protests. We did a historical piece on the Del Mar Divide and how that played into
Del Mar Avenue is a street that runs through St. Louis, and on the north, one side of it is low income, largely African American. Yeah. The other side is affluent, mostly white.
Yeah.
And the city has a long history, over 100 years, of institutionalized segregation. Like it was official policy in the city to keep people separated for almost 40 years.
Yeah, it's a policy in the U.S. that called redlining, which is not great, which is basically unsanctioned segregation of people owning housing on one side or the other, and the residual effects. And the story was about those residual effects and how they affect race in St. Louis today. Because we were there every day, because we were streaming every day, because we had such a reach, and people started to get to know us, and people started to come up to us by the end. So we got a lot of really great footage, and we felt really lucky because people felt like we were trying to tell like the correct story, not the violent story. So it's like 3 random lessons, and then we'll take questions. Prepare beforehand. Like if I could go back, I wish, and to this day I still have like a backpack packed with like duct tape, 3 battery packs, a water bottle, bandana, like stuff that you need for on the ground, like a go bag, essentially.
A Sharpie to write my phone number on your arm,
Yeah.
just in case you got arrested.
Yeah, I mean, there was random stuff that we ended up buying because now this just doesn't do that. It had never done that before. They didn't have go bags. They didn't do foreign correspondence or anything like that. So like a millennial focusing publication doing that, there was a lot that they had to learn about, like the gear that we had to take. But it did help us. Like I read all of the court documents on the plane on the way out to St. Louis. And so then we could ask better questions. Train teams to be nimble. We like almost every day talked to each other and made decisions on the story of what we would do almost every day.
Right, and like I mentioned before, every member of the team on the ground had a different role at a different point. Sometimes they would be running the cameras, sometimes they would be doing the interviews, sometimes they would be focusing on situational awareness. And so the team, because they were producers, very good producers and generalists, it allowed us to swap roles and on a moment's notice if it was helpful to cover a particular angle of the story.
Yeah, the folks who went that were not nimble, who were like, there was someone who was very used to hosting, and that's pretty much all that person could do. Yeah. It just didn't end up well. It didn't work with the team well. It didn't break out well. The people who were just like, okay, whatever you need, were a lot better. But it was nice to have someone who was removed from the story. And so Andy also had help in New York, which I guess we should mention. Andy we had a second person that was basically taking our footage and doing quick cuts out of them, like the short 90-second videos. So we were doing live coverage. We had some few short stories, and then we produced long stories out of it. I'm a big proponent of like don't waste stuff. So we used the crap out of all of the footage we got. Like we weren't, I know a lot of newsrooms when they do a live, they just like throw away the live and that's it. But we used almost all of our footage at some point or another.
Right. And then lastly, project management is a necessity. While on one hand, I thought we were well organized, or organized enough to succeed on the ground as it was happening, because the trip was planned at a moment's notice, and almost all of our energy was focused on local real-time logistics. Very little thought was put into what would happen afterwards, and so, as Kim mentioned, it was a bit of a struggle to get all the videos we wanted to be produced. And so if we were ever to do that again, we would ensure that there would be essentially a supervising producer or a production manager back, not on the ground, but in the office, who would be in charge of making sure all the footage is logged, knowing who has what footage, which stories are going to be produced at certain points, who the editors are going to be. Because those decisions were being made on the fly, it probably wasted a good month and a half. So it was a tough lesson to learn, but an important one.
Yeah, the roles were we didn't do a great job of defining roles once we got home. Everyone was just like, oh, I'm tired. We all went to bed for 2 days. But it was not, like the day after we got home, the ACLU decided to file a lawsuit against the city of St. Louis, and we were all supposed to have the day off because we had been working for 8 days straight, and all of a sudden I had to ask like a producer to drive across town because we hadn't logged the footage yet, and we needed footage that he had on his hard drive to produce a video, and it was just not. It's not great. We should have been logging footage along the way. We should have had somebody who was making sure that they were doing this. I think it's something it's a very startup problem.
Right,
if we were Reuters, this would not be an issue.
The difference between a broadcaster, a cable news organization, that this is their bread and butter and they do this dozens of times a day, versus a digital news startup where being deployed on the ground was the exception and not the rule. Yeah. Made for interesting times for this particular project. But ultimately, I think it paid off because, as Kim said, we were the first national organization on the ground to cover it. It also allowed us to build up trust with local activists and community leaders. And so even when the story got swarmed by other major outlets later that weekend and into the following week, we still had an in because they literally started recognizing our people on the ground.
Yeah.
So.
Are there any questions? There is a person with a microphone, if there are questions.
Hi, I'd like to ask about the audience side of online journalism, because being online is such an open space for comments, and especially talking about social issues, maybe people can be emotionally driven when they comment or have different beliefs and ideas.
Yeah.
So, or maybe ignore some more technical aspects of journalism. So how does that influence, if it does at all, the way of reporting? Like, is there... When do you know how to find a good balance between following, maybe listening to what audience wants, or when not to do that?
Generally speaking, the interactions we had on Twitter were very constructive and very supportive, and so I always made sure on TweetDeck that I followed @replies to the account, because people would give me tips on other live streamers or letting me know when someone got arrested. And so there was a bit of crowdsourcing happening organically because of the people there. In contrast, the people who would comment on Periscope or Facebook during the live videos there were completely unconstructive, and if not downright hostile.
I would say live video comments are trash.
Yeah.
They're trash.
You think about all the worst things on social media, that stuff was happening, especially when this is a story about an African-American man killed by a white police officer.
There were numerous very racist statements made. There were also just, I mean, there are things that I was not prepared for. I'm not a broadcast journalist. There were things I was not prepared for, like being on Periscope and running and then having people tell me, like, she must be out of shape. She's breathing really hard. I'm like, screw you, I just ran across town and I'm trying to tell you what's going on in this story. Of course I'm out of shape. I'm pretty sure you would do the same thing. Not letting those affect you is really hard. When you're there, you're like, I am tired. I am trying really hard. So with the best thing we do, another good thing about having Andy was, like, Andy just moderated all of that. I didn't even look at the comments. He gave me the good ones, and he turned off all, like, he reported all the bad ones on my Periscope. He, like, shut down my comments at one point because it was just too crazy. He watched all of our live comments for us, so we didn't have to filter that, because it takes time, and it made more sense.
It was easy enough to block people on Periscope as it was happening, because usually it would be a handful of bad actors who would be trolling and posting again and again, and so I would just go click and boom, they were gone. And I knew that each Periscope, by definition, has a finite length, and so I could keep an eye on that while doing all the other activities too, and essentially moderating and blocking the trolls as they came up. We didn't do that on Facebook. There's really no point to it when you have thousands of comments being posted, and Facebook threads to a certain extent self-regulate, because if someone says something dumb, your fans will then come and quash them and set them straight.
It's also, you're using your real name in most instances, so I think Facebook comments tend to be a little bit nicer, because people's real names
a little bit.
Slightly.
Yeah, but Periscope comments were just
Trash.
Awful. Total racist, awful.
Any other questions?
Thank you for the presentation. You said that you meet every day to decide stories. And I wanted to know, how do you find stories, and how do you do, like, short-term and long-term planning? Like, do you really see stories coming, or you decide day by day on stories you want to cover?
Can you go back to that picture of, like, Mike and Mandy and I? So, Maddie and I. So, one of the things we did was we took a couple production days in the middle of this. So we did one in the middle and then one at the end. So this picture, what you don't see, there was some conference going on. I stole a bunch of Post-it notes from this conference, and I wrote down every single interview or moment that we had. And this is me coming. I've done web production and design, so I was like, wrote down every good thing that we had done. And we did a lot of interviews that never made it into anywhere, but all the good things. And then we had this long list of Post-it notes, and I was like, okay, what are the stories that we can do with this? And so that's how we formed our long-form stories, by looking at, like, what the moments were and what they were. But while we were there, like I said, we shut down the server with footage. So there was a lot that we didn't use or that was only on live. And a lot of interviews that I thought would be useful, but later in the week were not useful. But that was handy because we had 10 people, so I could do a throwaway interview that never ended up to be anything. But a lot of them were, even the interviews, I would always ask, like, what do you think I should know, or can I take a photo of you on Twitter? So I tried to like use everything a little bit. The long-term planning was hard. And I think one of the questions we had was like, do we keep covering this? Like, when do we stop? When do we stop? Because after we went home, they were still, I think they're still protesting now. When do we go home? When do we stop? And that was a question of like, what can we add anything to this story? And it wasn't great. But every morning, I think every morning around 7 a.m., I would call either Andy or our editor, and we would talk through what everybody was doing for the day. And we would all sit down and have coffee. That was the first thing we did, sit down and have coffee. Where are you going today? What are you going to do? Just so we knew where everybody else was.
And generally speaking, the teams were broken up into one group following the governor and the local officials and the police, another group staying with the protesters, another group trying to keep in touch with local clergy, since faith leaders played a huge role in keeping the protests safe and nonviolent. And so with that general idea, before we even landed on our planes landed, it helped at least frame how we were going to cover it. But then things would happen spontaneously that we wouldn't expect. So like at one point, protesters were running down the street trying to get away from police who were arresting everyone. And there was a synagogue there, and the two rabbis there opened their doors and said, "Everyone get inside." Part of our team went inside as well, and the rabbis offered sanctuary to everyone there, and then went out to negotiate with police to allow everyone to leave without getting arrested. Yeah. And we streamed all of it live, and it was extraordinarily dramatic as it was happening, and it became clear that this needs to be packaged into a story that we could probably do in 90 seconds or 2 minutes. And so as soon as the stream ended, one of my colleagues in the New York office just grabbed the live stream and went to work doing what she does, making those 90-second videos, and boom, it was out there.
Yeah, she ran the script by us like on Google Docs, so we could look at it on our phones, and then it published. So that was nice to have somebody that was doing that was worrying about that kind of short-term coverage. So we could worry about like live and gathering stuff for a long form, and then somebody else would chop stuff up.
Producing those 1 or 2 minute videos, we were able to do constantly throughout it by having people in New York doing the cutting. It was the stuff shot on the cameras that weren't streaming, the higher quality camera, and those hours upon hours and dozens of hours of footage that we knew would take a while to get through. But even though it took so long, it was worth it. The final video turned out great. Got around 7 million views, 6 million views, something in that range, and so. Despite the challenges, was very much worth it.
I have 2 questions, asking for a friend. First thing is, back to the comments, as you were mentioning what you noticed about especially Periscope and also Facebook Live. If you think that there is something specific about live video that attracts people as if in a square of old times, like throwing stuff at you just because you're lap dancing in public or something, which is very weird because it doesn't really happen in any other sort of media that way, with that amount of. And if you have any thoughts about that. And the second thing is more practical, about tools and the way you organize the eye in the sky coordination. If you were using maps and if you knew at any given time where the street team was, more or less.
Yeah, I can answer the second part. So I had my desktops. Usually I work from home in DC, but I happened to be in New York when the story broke, so I changed plans and stayed in New York for an extra week, basically to help coordinate this. And so the most basic function I had was a space for TweetDeck, sort of monitoring local St. Louis news organizations, another list for activists. I had a Twitter list for all of the members of the team that were on the ground, so I could make sure I wasn't missing anything they were posting. I would keep a map open for whatever part of St. Louis the team was in. during occasions where things were getting stressful and potentially dangerous, Kim would do screenshots that showed her geolocation. You know, sometimes she could just say the intersection, it was easy enough to find, but sometimes during the chaos.
WhatsApp lets you send pins of where you are, which was very handy for us.
Yeah, so that became a very handy tool to track where everyone was. Were we still using Banjo at that point?
No.
No, okay. So, and then just organically using other social tools to figure out what's being discussed. I really tried to focus on monitoring the crazy matrix-like flow of information coming in from our team and others in St. Louis, and then just figuring out how to sort out which aspects of that should be curated into our coverage and which aspects of that should inform our behind-the-scenes logistics.
One thing on live video comments are trash. I think Periscope ones in particular were really bad, partially because you know how the way the comments happen, they kind of float up and then go away. Does anyone play HQ in here? The trivia phone app game. So they also have comments on there, and those are also trash, right? Because it's just, they flow by very quickly. And I think that's part of the reason, like sometimes. Okay.
I know you've had your hand up for a while. Yeah. I want to make sure that you got a question, so you can get the last question.
Hi, yeah, I was in a similar situation like around 2 years ago, like covering a protest. And one of the things that I noticed in my case was that, especially when you're covering something like police brutality, they're really looking out for people recording things on their phone, and they like to crack down on you. So like, I know this was like a long time ago, but ever since then, have you experimented with, I don't know, like a camera that's not that visible, maybe like a hidden camera, or like GoPro, something like that, something that's not as obvious as holding up a phone, and yeah, just a practical issue.
I think what was handy about having the phone was, so we did a couple things. Like I turned off the Touch ID on my phone so that if we got arrested, like we made this pact, like we would all turn off the Touch ID, so if a cop got us arrested, we'd be like, don't know the password, see ya. And they wouldn't let us use that kind of stuff. We also were just, if I could do this again, I would have just taken not my phone. I would have taken like an office phone and used that. The thing about those little cameras, like a GoPro or whatever, is I'm always worried about those, and then the footage lives on there. The nice thing about doing live coverage is like, once I'm live on Facebook, it's on the internet. Like the cops can do whatever they want, but it's on the internet.
And also the smaller the camera, the less stable it usually is, because you can get a GoPro, but you try to hold it by hand, your hands will shake, so you end up putting it on a mount anyway. And so, it's, and also we were there clearly as press, and I think it would have been disingenuous of us to try to pretend we weren't press. And in fact, it could have increased the likelihood of us getting arrested. And for doing interviews, if we tried doing interviews and didn't clearly have cameras, people would be really suspicious of us because maybe they think we were undercover cops. So, so that isn't something we would do. All right, well, we got to wrap up. Another session is about to start. Thanks for coming, everyone. If anyone wants to chat, we can head down to the other side while there are people coming here. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi.